we're going to have to be vigilant on two different fronts. We're going to have to defend the truth about the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, created male and female, created for marriage. We're also going to have to defend our freedom to live according to those truths.
Dr. Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and member of the White House Religious Liberty Commission, speaking at this year's Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference.
Over and over again, we're going to see that we have to form the next generation of our students, of our children, our grandchildren to believe the truth, while also defending our freedom to live it out. And then the long game is reforming our civil laws to reflect the truth.
You can watch Ryan Anderson's presentation, Making the Case for Social Conservatism, from the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference. For a donation of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch an on-demand video stream and download audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org. Can you really have freedom of speech and the free exercise of religion if you also have hate speech laws? And how is this being proven in the UK, in France, in Germany, or even East Europe? Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Joining us to talk about freedom of speech and religion in Europe, Lorcan Price. He's legal counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom International, and he joins us from London. Lorcan, welcome back.
Thank you, Todd.
So, if you would, give us an update on the case of Päivi Räsänen.
Yes, just this week we filed Päivi Räsänen's application to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Sadly, earlier this year we received a decision from the Finnish Supreme Court, which was a split decision, 3-2, but three of the judges unfortunately found that Päivi had indeed broken the law, the hate speech law in Finland, and therefore should be prosecuted for what they call incitement and fined a significant fine. And then, of course, a criminal conviction recorded against her. This was a very unfortunate outcome considering that we had won the case at the first instance court and then at the Court of Appeal, but lost on a split decision at the Supreme Court. They did, however, strike out the prosecutions against her in relation to the Twitter case, another case of remarks she made on a radio broadcast. But they prosecuted her, alas, for a pamphlet that she published around 2004, 2005, which set out the Christian view on the purpose of marriage and God's plan for human sexuality and the human person. They found that would be deemed insulting to homosexual persons and therefore in breach of Finnish hate speech law. So because that decision, in our view, was wrongly decided and undermines Päivi's right to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, we've taken that case now to the top human rights court in Europe, that is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and we will hope and pray and work diligently towards a good outcome from that court.
What is the purpose? What's the role of the European Court of Human Rights?
So the European Court of Human Rights was set up really in the years after the Second World War to provide a kind of a transnational guarantee for human rights in Europe. It's the court that makes findings based on complaints arising out of the European Convention on Human Rights. So the European Convention on Human Rights was formally legally adopted in 1950, and it guarantees, in law at least, the right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, private and family life, the prohibition of torture, the right to a fair trial, all the classic rights that we would think of as being attached to kind of liberal democracy and free nations. And the innovation really in this document was the creation of a transnational court, the first of its kind in history, that would act as a final court of appeal from any member state of the European Convention on Human Rights. Any individual will be able to take their case to the European Court of Human Rights if they were unhappy with the verdict in the domestic court. This court has become really quite important in European affairs. It has played a role in a range of things. For example, questions of privacy and state surveillance, questions relating to fair trial and the length of trial, the length of criminal proceedings against an individual, all sorts of issues to do with asylum and the right to refugee status. And then for Christians, it would, of course, deal with issues to do with the structure of the family, to what extent we can freely preach the gospel, even where it offends other people, and critical questions around the right to life as well, abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, and so on. So it has, since 1950 really, played a critical role in giving a final deciding vote or voice on these really critical constitutional and legal questions that come from all of the members of the Council of Europe, which is now upwards of 47 countries, whereas, of course, when the court was founded, half of Europe lay behind the Iron Curtain under communist rule. So it was really only Western Europe it applied to. But after the fall of the Iron Curtain, many, many more countries joined the European Convention on Human Rights, and the court really became, in a lot of ways, the preeminent court on the Eurasian landmass for human rights issues.
How is this court comprised? Who decides how it is comprised?
Well, every country that's a member or that is a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights is entitled to appoint a judge to the Strasbourg court. Those judges then, in turn, are divided into 5 separate chambers. So there's, as I say, a judge from each member state. That's 47 judges. So they split them across 5 chambers. We'll take an example. If you're in France and you've been arrested for hate speech and you're being prosecuted for hate speech, and ultimately you lose your case in the French courts, you can then appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. It will go to the chamber where the French judge sits in the first instance, and if you're successful, that's the end of the matter. France is obliged by the treaty to implement the decision of the court, in other words, overturning probably the domestic verdict and giving compensation. If you're unsuccessful at the chamber level, you can appeal with the discretion of the court to the Grand Chamber, which is a gathering of 17 judges drawn from across the different countries. That they sit occasionally for cases of exceptional importance, and they make a decision then. Once you have your decision, it depends on the particular country how they implement it, but the general approach is that if you have successfully argued that your human rights were breached, let's say by France or by the United Kingdom or Spain, you can apply in certain cases to the domestic courts to have that upheld, or simply you apply to your domestic government to be compensated and to have your conviction overturned, or whatever fine or penalty was made against you overturned.
What is the European Court of Human Rights track record when it comes to freedom of speech and religion?
The court in Strasbourg has a very mixed track record on both freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It's probably stronger on freedom of religion in that it has upheld, for example, the right to display religious symbols in public and in your place of employment. It has, in many cases, overturned or at least found European countries that restrict the establishment of churches to be in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. And it has recognized the importance of religion and freedom of conscience as a critical human right that must be protected by European countries. On speech, the picture is different, I'm afraid. Over the years, we've seen the court drift towards a position of effectively regarding more and more speech as being, more and more controversial speech as being legitimately prohibited by governments and by authorities under the rubric of hate speech. And the court has developed a doctrine that where speech is what they describe as designed to undermine or destroy the rights of others, that it's not worthy of the protections of Article 10, which is the right to freedom of expression in the Convention, and therefore will not even be considered as legitimate speech, where they then would engage in the normal kind of legal tests as to whether or not the restrictions were proportionate and balanced and so on. So if they make a preliminary finding that certain kinds of hate speech was designed to, as it were, kind of overturn the rights of other communities, then they simply won't even consider doing any further analysis of it. They'll just rule at the outset that it's hate speech, and they'll dismiss the case. This has been a disturbing development in my view, because it means then that, for example, robust criticism of, let's say, some of the practices associated with Islam increasingly is being criminalized by European governments, and the European Court of Human Rights is simply turning a blind eye to that trend by making these findings that critical speech of Islam is beyond the pale. It's hate speech and will not and cannot have the protections of freedom of expression. And for a human rights court to say that freedom of expression will not be applied to huge areas of public debate and public discussion, in my opinion, is a very troubling development.
So, do Western European countries have rights like the broad protections of the First Amendment rights in the U.S. Constitution, freedom of speech, and free exercise of religion?
Freedom of speech and free exercise of religion, they are recognized by the European Convention on Human Rights, but not, I would say, in the same robust way as they are by the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. And in their great wisdom, your founding fathers were quite explicit about the protections that they afforded to speech and to religion. Whereas in Europe, what was happening after the Second World War was an attempt to try and recognize that there were different legal traditions in various different European countries, and therefore to provide what might be regarded as a ground floor below which protections could not descend. So a basic protection, but in the way that these things often happen, through negotiation, everything, you end up with a compromised document, which is quite literally a compromise between all of the different parties, which, frankly, in my opinion, does not protect as strongly as it ought to the rights in question. So in the case of freedom of expression, for example, which is protected by Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the first provision of Article 10, paragraph 1, is clear that the right to freely express yourself is guaranteed. That includes the right to receive and to impart ideas. However, Article 10, paragraph 2, then creates a whole series of exceptions to do with public order, the rights of others, and security questions, and so on. So, in other words, what you end up with is negotiated compromise that is not quite as strong and as emblematic as it should be when it comes to guaranteeing human rights. And it so falls significantly short, I would say, of the kind of robust protection that you have in the United States on speech. And then, of course, the devil's always in the detail. When you come to implement these things, the jurisprudence from the European Court of Human Rights reflects in many ways the loophole is the wrong word, but let's say the compromises inherent in the text. And therefore, they say, yes, we uphold the right to protect freedom of speech. However, that does not include hate speech. And that's a very significant difference in terms of implementation compared to the United States, where the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently, for many decades, had a very robust level of protection in practice for freedom of expression. We have these rights in law in Europe. However, they are not as strongly articulated, unfortunately, as the rights that you enjoy in the United States.
How widespread are hate speech laws in Western Europe?
Well, hate speech laws are very widespread. And the objection that I and other colleagues who work on these issues will have is that the concept of hate speech is relatively new in the law. It really started to gain prominence in the 1970s and 1980s. And by the time we arrived at the 2020s, we've had them effectively uniformly created across Europe to certain, they are stronger and more oppressive in some countries than others, but there's not a European country now that does not have hate speech laws. In fact, if you're a member of the European Union, under a document called the Framework Directive on Combating Racism and Hate Speech in 2008, every country is obliged by the European Union to enact hate speech laws. So there's no question of derogating from this obligation unless you're actually in breach of European Union law. Now, if you're outside the European Union, which, for example, the United Kingdom is, and I'm speaking to you from London, as you mentioned, they still have hate speech laws, which they haven't repealed, even though they've left the European Union. And the unusual thing I think that will strike a lot of Americans as being quite bizarre is that the adoption of hate speech laws tended to be something that enjoyed bipartisan support in Europe over the years. So both conservatives and liberals would argue in many European countries that hate speech laws are a necessity in order to preserve social peace, to stop racism and homophobia and all that kind of Islamophobia and so on. Much of this is to do in many ways with when European societies became more ethnically and religiously diverse as a result of immigration. Countries decided then that it was necessary to start to implement these laws to prevent social fracture. So there's not a country, unfortunately, in Western Europe that does not have hate speech laws at this point in time.
We will talk more about freedom of speech and freedom of religion in Europe with Lorcan Price of Alliance Defending Freedom International on the other side of the break.
A podcast for thinking Christians. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
The church's music from the 20th century. The 17th century. The 11th century. The 8th century. The 4th century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jay Krause, principal at Metro East Lutheran High School in Edwardsville, Illinois. Metro East Lutheran High School engages young adults in a Christ-centered environment, delivering academic excellence and spiritual growth to develop Christian leaders for tomorrow. We provide a Christ-centered alternative to public high schools. We're currently enrolling students for the 2026-2027 school year. Learn more at melhs.org, melhs.org.
Through its Church Interpreter Training Academy, the Ephatha Lutheran Mission Society empowers signers to enhance their skills in conveying the Word of God to deaf and the hard of hearing. Learn more at elms-deaf.org. The Ephatha Lutheran Mission Society, elms-deaf.org. We're talking about freedom of speech and religion in Europe with Lorcan Price of Alliance Defending Freedom. Lorcan, in reality, can a country have hate speech laws and retain freedom of speech and religion?
I would say you cannot, no. When one thinks of, particularly for Christians, the religious obligation that Christians have in Scripture to spread their faith, to preach the gospel, to bring others to a relationship with Jesus Christ, that means implicitly in that is the requirement to be able to talk about what Christians believe in a whole range of different contexts. And that will frequently include questions to do with human sexuality, so-called gender identity, the purpose of marriage, and so on. And in those circumstances, you're almost bound to offend somebody if you say things now in contemporary society like Christians believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. Christians believe that there are only two biological sexes, male and female, and that's how it was created by God. Christians believe that the purpose of human sexuality is within marriage for the procreation, for giving birth to children. So those views would have been widely accepted for most of human history as being just self-evidently true. However, with the rise of, for example, gender ideology, there's now a breakdown in the understanding in contemporary society of the distinction between the sexes and the roles they ought to play in society and so forth and so on. And the Christian view on this is now increasingly seen as not just controversial, but as offensive and hateful and so on. And because hate speech laws protect, in many cases, or at least they purport to protect sexual minority communities, and this is the language they would use, from being insulted or offended or incited against, is often the frequent term used, incitement, you will find increasingly that people are being prosecuted, Christians are being prosecuted for sharing their faith on these issues. I and my colleagues represent individuals in the United Kingdom, for example, such as Pastor Dia Moodley, who has been arrested in the city of Bristol for preaching on marriage and on human sexuality because he was deemed to have offended a member of the gay community. So it is not possible, in my view, to have a whole series of hate speech laws controlling what can be said that may or may not offend somebody, and then also have authentic, genuine protections for religious freedom in practice.
Let's get into some specifics. Tell us about the state of freedom of speech and free exercise in the UK.
Well, we have a very serious free speech crisis in the United Kingdom, and this is something I've spoken to US lawmakers about in the past and individuals from your administration. Over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, we've had a series of legal prohibitions on hatred, incitement to hatred, that have built on top of each other to create this kind of comprehensive censorship state where what you're permitted to say in the public square and in public places and in public streets has been dramatically decreased for fear of running foul of one of these hate speech laws. And most of them are contained in a piece of legislation that's constantly being amended called the Public Order Act. So when it comes to so-called hatred against homosexuals or ethnic minorities, that's in Section 19. We now have new provisions, Section 7 of the Public Order Act, that prevent people from engaging in so-called influencing near abortion clinics. So in large areas, in public places near an abortion clinic, you're not even permitted to simply pray, to talk to people about abortion, to talk to people about religion, anything like that. So in effect, we've created these kind of sterilized public spaces where controversial views may not be expressed. When I say controversial, of course, I mean views that may upset or offend certain people are impermissible. And the state has used the power of the prosecution forces and the police to essentially clamp down on any expression that's deemed to be incitement to hatred. And it goes beyond this, of course, now into the realm of the internet and the online world. Much of our public speech and political discussion and discussion about big questions of society now happens online, on social media, on X and Facebook and so on. We have, in the United Kingdom, taken our hate speech laws and superimposed them on the internet through things like the Online Safety Act, which has large provisions to do with prohibiting illegal content online, which would include things like the things I've been describing, which is, let's say, Christian speech that criticizes gender ideology or that criticizes so-called gay marriage. So these things are increasingly now seen as criminal under the law in the United Kingdom. And not just, unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, but in other European countries as well. And Pai v. Rasmun's case that we mentioned at the outset is a very good example of that.
What about freedom of speech and religion in Germany?
Germany, in many ways, in my opinion, is ground zero of the censorship crisis in the European Union. You have a series of provisions in German criminal law, Section 186 and Section 188 are probably the most notable, that prohibit, again, incitement to hatred. And that includes increasingly the people who have gender identity claims and people who are homosexual claiming that legitimate and totally orthodox Christian views on sexuality are inciting hatred against them. And unusually in German law, and a lot of this has to do with, I suppose, German history, you have Section 188 that prohibits insulting somebody in public life. And this has become extremely controversial in recent years because of arrests made of individuals who criticize politicians. I think famously, one of the members of a recent German government, who is a member of the Green Party, was criticized by a retired person online. She was called an idiot. And then shortly after that, she made a criminal complaint to the police. And the police conducted an armed raid on this person's house, kicked their door in and arrested them for a breach of Section 188 of the German Criminal Code. So Germany has some very serious problems, I think even worse than the United Kingdom when it comes to free speech. And the reason this is a problem for all of us in Europe is that very often the Germans set the tone when it comes to European laws in relation to online content and what's permissible in social media. A particular example of this is that in 2017, after the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, German lawmakers became concerned that a lot of the political changes were being driven by online hatred coming from the right, and they passed a piece of legislation called the Network Enforcement Act, which gave German prosecutors very wide powers to fine internet companies, which are largely, of course, almost exclusively US-based, for permitting hateful content, so-called hateful content, from being published online. This legislation in 2017 in Germany became really the inspiration for the European Union then adopting a piece of legislation called the Digital Services Act, which came into force in 2023. In many ways copies what the Germans had already put in place, but applies it to the entire European Union, and arguably has an extraterritorial effect outside the European Union, impacting speech that Americans put online that can be seen by Europeans on platforms like X and like Meta and Facebook and so on. So Germany, in a lot of ways, is both oppressing its own citizens on questions of free expression, but also exporting its model beyond its borders through the European Union into creating a kind of a German approach to policing the entire internet.
Let's move to France. What is the case there?
In a very similar way, really, to the other countries that we've mentioned, the French, starting in the 1970s, started to adopt these incitement to hatred laws, and they've become powerfully used against political opponents in France by the authorities. So France has a longer-standing approach to incitement. In the United Kingdom, it was governed by the common law rules, which were abandoned by the United States after the adoption of the Constitution and breaking the political link with England. In France, they went a different way. They were probably the first country to introduce legislation back in the 1880s that criminalized incitement, and that has been expanded then subsequently in the same kind of way in the 1970s and 1980s to include hatred against people based on their ethnic origins or based on their sexuality and so on. And what's notable about France is the number of politicians that are being prosecuted under these laws, which gives it a certain kind of political controversy, quite aside from the religious controversies I mentioned earlier. So you've had Eric Zemmour, who was a candidate for the French presidential election in the last election cycle. He has been prosecuted for hate speech, even though he's a well-known journalist and commentator for criticizing Islam. We have Marine Le Pen, who's the leader of the National Rally Party in France and is going to be challenging, well, she'll be seeking office as president of France in the election in April next year. She is also being subject to a criminal prosecution investigation for breaching France's hate speech laws, again for criticizing Islam. And the common theme you see in France really is so-called Islamophobia being prosecuted by the authorities and in a lot of ways weaponized against politicians on the political right for criticizing what has been a very large influx of Muslims into France over the last, really, since the 1960s, and has had an enormous impact on French society. And things became a lot more fraught politically after the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo magazine and the Bataclan theatre and the massacre of over 80 people on the Promenade des Anglais in Nice. So when those things happened, of course, as you can imagine, there was significant criticism of immigration policies from right-wing parties, and the French authorities' response to this wasn't necessarily to engage with the substance of the criticism, but was to prosecute the people who were criticizing Islam, criticizing immigration policies. So France, I think, uniquely has a record for very heavy use of these laws against politicians, particularly from the political right.
How do most Eastern European countries fare in regard to freedom of speech and religion?
Well, it's a very mixed bag. Those countries are all post-Soviet. Some of them, in the case of Ukraine and Belarus, were actually in the Soviet Union. Others then, like Poland and Romania and Hungary and so on, were in the Warsaw Pact, but necessarily controlled by communist regimes. They have a legacy then of adopting communist-era rules into their law about church registration and control of religious communities. Many of them have, for example, a church ministry, in other words, a government department that is responsible for church affairs, where if you're establishing a religious community, you're required in a lot of ways to clear it with the authorities to get permission to set up a church, to establish a legal entity, to own property, to employ people, and so on. And it's at this point that you often see unnecessary and unreasonable restrictions being placed, particularly on, I think it's fair to say, on evangelical Protestant denominations, many of whom arrived into countries like Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary after the fall of the Iron Curtain in the 1980s. And many of the cases that we've been involved in, and my colleagues and I over the years, have been to try and challenge ridiculous, overbearing, unwarranted, unnecessary rules placed by these government church ministries on religious communities from establishing themselves and so forth. So I think that legacy of communist era approach to regulating religion and seeing it as something that needs kind of government involvement in allowing it to operate has been carried over now into this post-communist democratic era. Similarly, on the speech question, it's more of a case the rules there are imposed by the European Union rather than a kind of a communist legacy. Of course, historically, when it comes to hate speech laws, communist countries were really at the forefront of arguing in favor of restricting speech on the basis of controlling incitement to hatred and so on. If one goes back to the debates in the United Nations in the 1960s around international law, it was the communist bloc that was arguing for restrictions on speech, and it was the Western countries, Western Europe and the United States and so on, that were arguing in favor of free speech. In a lot of ways now, things have changed. If you look at the European Union, you have Western countries like France and Germany who are arguing for more restrictions on speech. And then Hungary and Poland historically have been the countries arguing for, in some cases, more freedoms against the European Union. So one of the quirks of history when it comes to free speech, at least, has been that the roles are reversed, and that very frequently you're more free to criticize, if we take the example of Islam, in Poland and in Hungary than you are in France or Germany. And I think that's a rather sad state of affairs.
What advice would you offer the U.S. regarding avoiding the curtailing of freedom of speech and religion in Europe?
Well, as I mentioned, you are blessed in the United States that the great wisdom of your founding fathers was to protect, at the very outset of the Bill of Rights, to protect freedom of expression and free association of religion. Because if you don't have these cornerstones of freedom in society, you really don't have, in many ways, a functioning democracy, in my view. What you need to take from Europe is a cautionary tale of what to avoid. We have now created a situation where there's enormous social tension as a result of mass migration into European countries. And instead of addressing the substantive concerns in relation to mass migration, the approach of European authorities is to prosecute and to delete speech and to punish internet companies for allowing free speech on their platforms. And that, frankly, means that we don't have, in many important regards, a functioning democracy, because if you have a media sector that's heavily dominated by state broadcasters that are funded directly by the government, and then we have an online sector that's increasingly regulated to remove this critical speech of immigration or gender ideology and so on, then there's very little outlet for the average person to hear points of view that are not tightly controlled in terms of the narrative by the authorities. So for the United States, the point is really to avoid allowing European approaches to controlling speech online and in the public square under all circumstances, to avoid that drifting into US law, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. And the fact that you have the recourse to federal courts and even your own state level courts to uphold freedom of speech based on the First Amendment is a great blessing. I really wish we had something similar here in Europe. However, one kind of bright point I would mention is that there's an increasing awareness now among Europeans that they are being censored in a way that is increasingly intolerable, that it's really quite staggering just how much speech is being restricted, how many people are being prosecuted, and the lengths the government is prepared to go in different European countries to controlling the narrative. And public discontent is growing with that, or growing on that subject, rather. I think we may well see, or at least I'm hopeful that we will see changes in the future to start repealing these hate speech laws when new parties and new political movements take power.
Lorcan Price is legal counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom International. He joined us from London. You can find out more about Alliance Defending Freedom on the Talk On Demand archives page at issuesetc.org. Lorcan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd.
Pastor Chris Roseborough of Fighting for the Faith will be our guest next. It's This Week in Pop Christianity. We'll evaluate David Crank's teaching on overcoming limiting beliefs.
And I think we have to ask, do today's Marxist activists have any reason to say that they hate above anyone else in the world the church leaders most celebrated by our cultural elites? Or do they find that their efforts are not only not hampered by Christian cultural elites, but are in fact helped by them?
Megan Basham of the Daily Wire, speaking at the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
We must resist the infiltrators and use our power in such a way that when those who oppose the cause of Christ are asked who they hate most in the world, they think of our names.
You can watch Megan Basham making the case against progressive influence in the church from this year's Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org.
We're supported by listeners like you. You're listening to Issues Etc.
Lutherans for Life provides unique gospel-centered, life-issue-focused educational resources, audio-video training, post-abortion counseling, and more from a Lutheran perspective. Learn about LFL resources and forming a life team or life chapter or becoming a life advocate by calling 888-364-LIFE or by calling 888-364-5433 or visiting lutheransforlife.org. lutheransforlife.org.
What do Jesus and Paul teach about marriage, divorce, unchastity, and desertion? The Issues Etc. book of the month for July is Divorce and Remarriage, Ecclesiastical Discernment and Pastoral Care. This new resource is published by Concordia Publishing House. Their phone number, 1-800-325-3040. You can learn more about divorce and remarriage at issuesetc.org. Divorce and Remarriage by Dr. Ben Mays, the Issues Etc. book of the month for July.